There's a great line from a Matt Taylor from The Chain. It was one of the first acts I managed. I remember when I was young, the Beatles turned me on. They really blew my mind. And in the generation of the 60s, music was wild, it was raucous. But in this country, it was a backyard industry. There was some great talent here, but it's very interesting back then that I don't think I bought my first single until I was 11 or 12 years old. I remember it was Pretty Woman by the late and great Roy Orbison. And I guess what's really changed over the generations is how music's become so universal, whether it's kids of 2 or 3 or whether it's people going to see the late and great Leonard Cohen in their 80s. What attracted me to it was a couple of mates of mine came to me when I was at school, and we decided to promote a couple of dances in the school holidays. And I was a pretty shy guy, believe it or not, and music got the bug. It was exciting, and as Billy Joel said, exactly what I'm going to say. It used to help me pick up girls. I just thought it was fun at an early age. I never thought of it as a business. I came from a very well-educated family. I was very fortunate in the sense of Mount Scopus College. I never knew for many years how I wrangled to get out after 6th grade, and the truth I found out many years later from my elder sister was that I refused to do Hebrew, which was a compulsory subject. And I moved on to Caulfield North, and I got in the real world. I got a lot of shit, but I learned a lot. And fortunately for my father, more particularly than my mother's point of view, I scraped into Melbourne High, because in those days you needed big results to get into Melbourne High. And I guess I'd be in the top 5 of people. Number 1, without a doubt, is the great Lindsay Fox. But I'd be in the top 5 people that didn't finish Melbourne High, because by this stage I was running dances and I really got the vibe, because it was so frustrating seeing Australian artists no different to Australian designers, no different to Australian cars. Everything was about imports back then. So I saw an incredible opportunity, but it never really had a business plan, and it's really been a dream come true, and a dream that's still continuing. I was in a situation where I was making a few bob. I picked the wrong subjects for what we called matriculation, which is HSC. I learned one thing at Melbourne High, and that was read what you're going to sign, because I joined the cadets, and once I joined I couldn't get out, and I was never an early morning person. I was always a late night person, even when I was a young kid, and to be woken up at 6 a.m. at Puckapunyal, up, shine your shoes, etc. You learn. The way I've lived my life is you always look on the bright side of life, and you make a mistake, there's a positive side to that mistake, and you move on. So basically, I was offered a job by the biggest local dance promoter at the time. You got to understand, at that time, dances were Coca-Cola and Fanta, and Melbourne was raging, whether it be Broadmeadows, Frankston, Ringwood, Ormond, Box Hill, St Kilda. It was vibrant. There was gigs at lunchtime. So the third time, Bill Joseph, who was the part manager later on of AC/DC, who was the big shot, said to me, "This is the last time I'm offering you a job." And it was about September. My parents were in Israel. They were away for a month or so. And I have no regrets, good on you, but the minute my father got home and I left school, I was thrown dead straight out of the house. And look, that was mostly the right thing to be done. It certainly made me realise that I'd made a serious commitment, and the journey began from there. Let's get one thing real straight. I came in from the lowest possible level. Yes, I was running a few dances. We were making a few bob. I worked in the cloakroom. I got busted by the police putting up posters, and I had really good people to teach me the ropes, though. And I think that's something that fundamentally has continued through the decades as music's become of so much more interest, not on a music level, but for people to make a career of it. I think what's so important in life in general is who your first two bosses are. And from Bill Joseph, before I worked for him, I went on the road with the legendary Bon Scott. I'll never forget it. I was 16. I'd never been outside Melbourne, and we went on a bus to Adelaide. We stayed. The Valentines were in that pop era. Bon had an incredible voice, and it's hard for people to believe that he used to wear orange and yellow frilly shirts, and he was just a great bloke. And I think that trip had a lot to do with me making the final move, to leave school. And people don't understand. Back then, the Australian music business was very backyard. A lot of it was very shoddy. And look, if you think the evolution of Mushroom Records was a 3-year business plan with accountants, bank managers, etc., it wasn't. It was just heart and soul, gut feel, out of frustration. By this stage, I'd been an agent and a manager, and there was incredible frustration, and it sounds hard for people to believe today, but some of the most creative bands I worked with that were signed to big labels, small labels, some never made albums, but they were told what to record. They were sometimes told what their album cover was going to be. And to me, when I was working closely, and I was younger than most of the musicians I was working with, there seemed something that was completely remiss, and that was the creative freedom. And if you're going to sign an artist, unless you really wanted to have, and there's been quite a few of them, if you wanted to have a real artist, you had to let the creative juices come. And a lot of the acts that I worked with were incredible live. And you've got to remember, back then, a record as such cost that much, and a ticket to get into a gig cost that much. And fortunately, I was involved with both sides. And most of the original Mushroom acts were all acts that played live all the time. People wouldn't believe it. Some acts back then played 3 gigs in one night. And it was the days, I guess, where it was, rock and roll at its wildest, the stories about TVs out of the windows. It wasn't looked at as a business, and that's one of the things I think my father didn't understand. When I used to sit down and we would do the banking and stuff, he'd think I was playing Monopoly. And I've got no anger or bitterness towards it. I was an afterthought, the only Gudinski to be born in Australia. So I guess I was pretty lucky, really, because I think the rock business in Russia wouldn't have been good for me. Look, the first bands I managed were all blues-orientated or very music-orientated. And I thought that was a great basis for me. Carson, Healing Force, who had one of the greatest songs of all time and yet never made an album, and The Chain. And when 2 of those bands broke up within 2 weeks of each other, I thought, this is not right. My life was falling apart, and I realised then that these guys needed to have creative control. They needed to have input into developing their careers, and that's why Mushroom started. It wasn't a big business plan. It was about letting the artists have their creative freedom and have their creative vision. 100% it came from being a music fan, out of frustration seeing the acts break up. And if you go through the years to today, really the most successful long-term artists, be it Bruce Springsteen, be it Dave Grohl, be it the young fella, the gifted Ed Sheeran, they're all fans. And they're listening to music all the time. They're listening to other influences. Sure, there's lots of one-hit wonders and lots of pre-packaged artists, but most of the real people that have been in the music business, front as artists, back in the business, that have been long-term successful, have been real fans. And I was pretty lucky. I had a bad piano teacher, couldn't play a note. Barnesy told me, don't even sing in the shower. So there was no frustration from my end. I knew my place and I knew how to get the best, or how to try and take these people to higher and greater levels. I learned a lot from Michael Browning. He used to book two of the very important clubs in Melbourne at the time, Bertie's and Sebastian. And really, a lot of people in the music business did it part-time. It sounds very strange to say, but I had financial difficulty when I was pretty young. And if you're an entrepreneur, it happens. Hopefully, I was very lucky that it happened early in my career. It's happened to a lot of people later in their career, and it made me realise no matter how hip or cool Mushroom or any company I was involved with was, if you couldn't pay the bills and you were living a dream, you were shit. I think it was a great advantage that I grew up and lived in Melbourne. All the big record labels at the time were in Sydney, and yet, as it turned out, the variety shows, the Famous in Melbourne Tonight's, obviously Countdown, Night Moves, so much of this came out of Melbourne. Now, really, we didn't sign a Sydney act for a long time. We didn't have a Sydney office for a long time. We actually had an office in Perth, if you could believe it, before Sydney. And Alberts were the big company in Sydney. They were independent. I only met Ted Albert once or twice. He died young. But he could play music, and he really inspired me with things like the Easy Beats. And to see the Easy Beats, which I was such a fan of, go overseas, and to see the tyranny of distance that we seem to have. And there was a big thing called the Hoadley's Battle of the Sounds. And you'd win the Battle of the Sounds, you'd go on a boat to England, which would take weeks. Most of the winners had already had such fights and broken up by the time they'd got to England. But the tyranny of distance was a really big factor back then. And I could see, and would have been so frustrating for the Easy Beats, who should have been one of the biggest bands in the world, that it didn't quite happen. Yes, they were huge here. Yes, David Bowie recorded Friday on My Mind. But Alberts in Sydney had their in-house production team, most probably the greatest production team of all time in Australia, Vander and Young. So I didn't have that kind of backup, but we had a bloody good go. And we had a good go because I had a feel they were studio kings, I was a live king. And that's where Sunbury really came into play. And Sunbury was such an important part of the development of Australian music. Yes, there was Woodstock. Now, let's face it, Woodstock had 500,000 plus people. I was actually watching Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock the other day. It's still so inspiring. And yet Sunbury had 35,000, but it was Australia's Woodstock. And the most important thing that Sunbury really did was the first 2 years particularly, it was all Australian artists. And I think it was the birth of Australians celebrating a bit with their own. And it was ironic that the year they really got into the internationals with, I think, Deep Purple, it actually rained. It was the end of Sunbury because they were trying to go to a bigger level. But the initial couple of years of Sunbury was really when Mushroom started. And the thing that I had to do, and I knew what I was doing, I had a mission and I had a plan, and that was there were so many small labels that came and went. The big 6 labels at the time, which is now down to, I guess, the big 3, or maybe 4, we wanted to make sure that people knew we were here. And the drama that I had to create the triple album with incredible packaging and some other incredible things for people that know why I'm smiling on the cover was an absolute statement. It was a very expensive package, but I wanted people, whether you were at a radio station in Warragul, Sydney, Perth, to know that Mushroom was a label that was here to stay and was to really develop and take artists, hopefully, to the world. And that really started to come true quite quickly. I've always had a weird sort of thing where if a business doesn't work, don't blame the name, blame the people running it or blame the business. And this has happened a number of times over the years. Michael Browning and I had a company called Consolidated Rock. What a great name, seriously. This is, and he managed Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, and I looked after the Chain, and we had a number of other acts, but we weren't playing the pop cycle as such. And there was a period in time where there was a radio ban, so there was a lot of very successful Australian artists just doing mimics of English songs. Mushroom was never part of that. Neither was Consolidated Rock. So at Consolidated Rock, we decided to set up an intimate club, and we did it in Alma Road, St Kilda, ironically. And we called it the Magical Mushroom Mansion. And one of the great sayings of mine through my whole career, and it continues, is you want to be a leader, not a follower. What's on the radio today isn't necessarily going to... You're too late if you're trying to do what's happening now, next. That's not to say that things aren't cyclic and musical influence and music can come back around in generations. But the Magical Mushroom Mansion was ahead of its time. I remember when I first went to America years later, there was a hip, cool place called Nell's, and it was exactly what the Mushroom Mansion was, except we had a few problems. 1, we had no permit. 2, we couldn't sell alcohol. But we had a great concept, and we got all this furniture from the Salvos, and we had this house, and it was rocking. After the second weekend, shut down. But again, you learn. So I learned if you're going to do shit like that, you've got to do it properly, and you go on. But that's really, that mushroom name really came out of the Magical Mushroom Mansion. Liberation was a name I'm proud of because I think in a very chauvinistic business as it was back in the 60s and 70s when I really got going, we had so many great women in senior positions, and for me to come up with that name, Liberation, even though it was a failed import shop in Greville Street, when I look back on it and I see how the world is today, you know, it makes me feel proud, and I'm glad I persisted with that name as well. But look, a name is what you make of it. But going back to my original principle, if you don't get it right, I don't think the name is necessarily long, but names are so important. And I love coming up with original names all the time. We've had lots of Australian names. We've had companies overseas because Mushroom got ripped off overseas. I couldn't use the name there. I had Emu, Bunyip, Toadstool, you name it, Oz Records, whatever. But, you know, the thing that's very noticeable is that back then, acts did it because they loved it. They didn't do it because there were so many musicians that loved playing music that were part-time. There were so many musicians that became hugely successful that never thought they'd have a number one record. I can't believe, looking back at the first 6 acts we signed to the Mushroom label, that one of them, Professor, I always had nicknames for acts. We had a band called Mackenzie Theory. And Rob McKenzie was very intelligent, and I used to call him the Professor. Now, this was an instrumental band. Who in their right mind would sign an instrumental band? I still wonder why I did, but it gave the label real credibility. Real musicians used to look at the label, and I think we were, like I said, I think by this stage we really had a feel and really had Melbourne down. One thing that really should be clear is one of my arts has been hiring and getting some of the best people. There's an art to it, and one day we'll have a reunion. And if you look at the Mushroom Trio over the years, Chuggy managed a band from Tasmania. We were the agents. He's an iconic figure in Australian music, you in the black T-shirt, as we know. And when I got his band a good week of bookings, I used to get free sheets because he was a linen salesman. And the couple of the band worked at the ABC, and a couple of them worked in an electrical company. But that's how it was then. People just loved being part of it and doing it. And yes, Chuggy moved on to Sydney. He set up there. At that stage, we'd separated. Michael Browning really took the tyranny of distance and took Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs to England. And they were the loudest band I've ever heard in my life. I became a long-term friend of the late and great Lobby Lloyd. He found me a number of acts. A lot of people couldn't understand him, but I knew one thing: I couldn't hold a cigarette like that, and I couldn't play a guitar like he did. He found me, for example, the Sunny Boys. He also found the Hootie Gurus, which weren't on our label at the time. But the tyranny of distance was a real thing then. And the problem was that because of Australia's population, there was so much great talent here. Elton John talks about this a lot, because when he first came to Australia, he loved Australian music, be it Daddy Cool. You know, he talks, I saw one of the classic countdowns just the other night, and he talks so clearly and well, and he's so young then, but he was blown out about the local talent. But the distance and so many Australian acts that became big left it too long, I guess, to make that step to go overseas. The Skyhooks were most probably a band I managed, the band that put Mushroom Records on the map. I don't think Mushroom Records would have continued. They came out of nowhere. They were very different to everything else that was around. Their song summed it up. Everyone was wearing blue jeans. Well, they certainly weren't. And yet, by the time we had all this enormous success and everyone thought, oh, Mushroom Records is on fire, we're killing. Well, let me tell you, all that first album did was save our bacon and literally pay our bills. But by the time they went overseas, they were used to being big stars already. And I think that mentally gets in people's heads. And really, the Skyhooks were an intelligent version of Kiss before Kiss. By the time they got to America, Kiss had exploded. We were actually supposed to support them in Cleveland. We turned up and they saw the makeup and they threw us off the show. And it was, you know, it's all very well to be wise in hindsight. I wish I'd gone to America a few years earlier with the Skyhooks. It was frustrating. They became number one and could sell 10,000 tickets in Jacksonville, Florida, but basically anywhere else, it was tough going. So you live and learn, and that was one of my great frustrations at the time, because they were such a unique, smart, witty band. By the time Skyhooks started to happen, Sherbet was already a very big band, and was like, even though we were all mates, and most of the greatest manager, without any doubt, Roger Davies, came from Melbourne. He's another one that worked through the agencies and etc. But Sherbet actually took Skyhooks to Sydney, and they played these two shows when the Opera House was first built. A lot of people don't know this, but when the Opera House was first built, obviously there was a lot of controversy about the design, how it had blown out of budget, the guy got dumped. It was shocking. But one thing he did muck up is you couldn't see the stage from the first 6 rows. But the venue, as you know it now, has just become iconic around the world, as has the Harbour Bridge. But Sherbet actually took us to Sydney and really helped us. And it started to become, by this stage in the 70s, it was a national touring business. And the fact that I was involved in the agencies, management, publishing, etc., in America that would have been against the law because they have a thing called, basically in some ways you could interpret it as a conflict of interest. But being a small market like this, we would have never existed without one or two of the other companies pulling their weight and helping. But things really, really changed. And timing and good luck has got a lot to do with life, as we know. And bang, here came Countdown, Bring It On. And who was the band that looked like incredible in colour? The Skyhooks. So really, the timing of Countdown and Skyhooks, and then a lot more of my other acts, a lot more of Australian acts, it really changed without any doubt the complete face of Australian music. It was beamed into every country town, every place. And if a song was on Countdown, you'd know on the Monday the reaction to it, and it used to force radio stations that wouldn't look at a lot of Australian music into getting real. Let's give the public what they want. And I can't overplay how important Countdown was in that period through the mid-70s until its demise, which really shouldn't have happened. People got sceptical and cynical about it. It was uncool to be on it. Bullshit. That show was watched by, there was very few shows then that you'd actually watch and the family'd watch and they'd complain, how could this guy be wearing this or how could this be going? But it really did not only put Australian music on the map, it broke so many international acts, be it ABBA, Blondie, we all know. And what it was an obvious thing because in England they had Top of the Pops. Now, Top of the Pops mostly lasted twice as long as Countdown. And one of the greatest regrets that I had was some of the cynics in the music business and Countdown finishing. And the great thing about Countdown is Molly, as crazy as he was loved. More than Prime Minister, still loved, but he had wide music tastes. Just because he liked dance music didn't mean that he wouldn't promote Devo. And that show, without any doubt, changed the face of Australian music. Festival Records was the big Australian independent. At the time, I never knew that Rupert Murdoch owned it. It was mostly like a freckle on his finger on the side here. He owned this amazing company called Festival. And Festival had all the big international independent labels. They had Ireland, the labels that inspired me, Chrysalis, then later on Virgin. But without any doubt, they had the most amazing label called A&M Records, which was Herb Alpert, who did have an instrumental hit. And it started in the west of Sydney. And A&M really became a big help and an influence to me. Festival was run by an incredible man called Alan Healy, who worked for News. News Limited. He went on to straighten Channel 10 out when Rupert bought Channel 10. He was most probably like a godfather to me. He backed me all the way, and he really opened up the doors internationally for me. And Festival started to fall apart. I started to realise, as much as they'd given me such great backing and everything else, that we needed to stand alone. We needed to start distributing international music because of relationships I was building up. And Festival, at the time, the people who were running it under Alan didn't like that. And that was the rebirth of the name Liberation. And Liberation actually went through EMI. And I remember a senior person at Festival saying to me, this will be the end of Mushroom. Well, it wasn't the end of Mushroom because it developed so many relationships for me, because it's one thing going overseas and meeting people, but you get people at that, in the 70s and early 80s, coming all the way to Australia, and you look after them, you get a bond together. So it opened a hell of a lot of doors for me, and eventually Liberation became very successful with labels like Stiff Records. We had the whole Joe Cocker catalogue and still do today, the late and great, and we started to utilise it because it was a tyranny of distance for these people as well. I mean, how the world has changed. Social media has made such a difference, as we all know, but it's made good and bad difference. But so many musicians start to be successful in Australia, and for a small country, big in size, and New Zealand, it became a very, very popular touring market. And I was right on top of that. And this is really where there was a company called Gudinski that actually failed, but did the first Blondie tour, did Joe. I did a lot of blues artists like Muddy Waters, Willie Dixon, Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. And I think that blues background gave me a real feel of music rather than, I hated the word from when I was young, and I still hate it today, product. We couldn't have survived. We had a silkscreen printer downstairs. These days, I mean, how we health and safety practices, who knows? It was very important to have the group. What was very different that people don't understand, and they say Michael Gudinski in Australia was one of the first with the 360 model. The difference was, unlike the big companies, we actually did have a merchandising company. We did have a publishing company. So we could service those areas, but we never manipulated it for right or for wrong. We wouldn't put a gun at the axe head and said, you've got to be with every one of our companies. We certainly tried to make sure we had the publishing. And you got to understand, at the time, a gold album in Australia was 35,000 copies, and you're competing against, incredible international artists that have got so many other markets. So it was, it was a long struggle, and had I not had the touring and the merch and these other things, we wouldn't have got through it. Simple as that. The relationship festival was good and long, and they were on a good deal. That, look, for me to talk illy about any of that would be wrong. They broke. They signed originally, I think, Olivia, and through Olivia they had some involvement with Cliff Richard. And then when I went with mostly the maddest, zaniest band of all, Split Ends, I knew we had to go to England, and Festival had an office over there, and I used to go in there with long hair and a beard, and they couldn't understand how I'd be taking money every week. What are the Australian bosses thinking of this crazy dude? And Split Ends, even before Neil Finn joined them and I Got You happened, Split Ends were so close to breaking England. They were selling out. They really were one of the leaders of the video age. And I'll never forget Molly coming into my office and going, Michael, you've had this band forever. They're going to set you broke. And then young Neil Finn joined the band, and Crazy Phil Judd left the band. And the next album, thank God I hung in, was True Colours, and had I Got You on it, and the rest was history. But even with that album, it illustrates the mindset that we had at Mushroom. We did versions with 6 different covers, laser etched. We always tried that old saying, leaders not followers. We did these little cigarette packet type cassettes. We were always very interested in different marketing tools. But look, the 70s is a long time ago, and there's a lot more to talk about. Women had added so much to the label. It was ironic, I'll never forget that song, Women in Uniform, and 4 of our staff were in it. But it just wasn't something I said about. It just seemed like the right thing to do. And there were some superstar women, and there were some superstar men. what made me most probably look good in hindsight, it was one of the businesses that was mostly more chauvinistic than a lot of others. And I think by giving a lot of those women that did a lot of great work for me, Annie Wright, who you mentioned, went to set up Mushroom America. There was so many great women. And when I look back on it, as a tactical move, I wish I could tell you that I was trying to be a leader. We were very much Australia's independent rock label. And I realised that as I was getting older, all the acts that we were going to sign weren't necessarily acts that I was a fan of or that I liked. Things got bigger, music got bigger, diversification got bigger. People forget that we had Christy Allen before Kylie Minogue. She was produced by one of the great Australian producers that worked with Tina Turner, that was in a band when I was a kid that I used to go and see called The Twilights, Terry Britton. So it was delivered to me on a platter, and we had huge success. And it was the first time that I'd signed someone without meeting them. And when I met her, I got a shock because it wasn't what I expected. She was such a great girl. It's so sad that she died young. She was one of the first people to jump on board for the Mushroom 25th. So we had a little bit of a taste of pop, but it was sophisticated. Terry Britt lived in England. It was produced slick. When Kylie came along, it was very different. My sister had moved to England many years before, and I'll never forget hearing the demo tape of The Locomotion, and I thought, the song's a smash. We were a career label then, but number one songs are number one songs. Was I a bit sceptical about it? Yes. Fortunately, I went to London and I said to my niece and nephew, who would have been 13 and 10 at the time, do you think I should sign Kylie Minogue? And they go, what? I said, do you think I should sign Kylie Minogue? And they didn't know what I was talking about. So in those days, it was you'd get on the phone late at night and you'd ring. So I go, what are you talking about with Kylie Minogue? My niece and nephew don't know her. They said, maybe you should ask her, Charlene. So the next day they come home from school and I said, I mean Charlene. They start screaming, yelling, you've got to be kidding. And it's amazing the impact that shows like Neighbours, Home and Away had and how huge they were in England, but how they never even got a shot or worked in America. I still can't comprehend it to this day. We speak English. It's bizarre. And when I saw years later The Office being made into an American version, I thought, America, they always want a remix, they always want their own producer. But ironically, the one show that worked when I was around that period was Prisoner. But how Neighbours and Home and Away didn't work, but they were massive shows, and Mushroom did the music to both of those shows. Now, if you ask me honestly, did I think Kylie Minogue was going to have the career she had? She hates me saying this, but this is for history, and she is my fellow patron, and we're still, to this day, I think she'd be the only act I've ever worked with that I've never raised my voice to. She comes from she's just, I would take a bullet for that girl. And Gary Ashley, who was, again, a guy that came up, started as the poster boy, did whatever, he was the one that moved and was very keen and went to England. When we signed Kylie, I had a couple of key radio rock people say to me, I will never forget it, and I'm not going to name them, and we laugh about it to this day, this is the end of the Mushroom label. Well, let me tell you, it was the beginning of a whole wider Mushroom label, and she has just been Australia's greatest ambassador. So Kylie went to England with Gary, because we had some interest from the Locomotion. A lot of people in England don't realise Kylie had a #1 record in Australia way before she went to England. So she went to England to meet Stockacre and Waterman, who were on a roll. It was no different to America, or over the years in England, there'd be production teams that couldn't miss. They'd have 3, 4, 5 acts in a row, hit, hit, hit. So Stockacre and Waterman talked to Gary about signing Kylie, and this was really quite embarrassing. It all ended very happily. So Kylie gets time off from Neighbours, goes to England. She sat there for 10 days waiting for Stockacre and Waterman to call her into the studio. On the way to the airport, she did that day the vocal for the new version of Locomotion, and I Should Be So Lucky. Now, to me, I Should Be So Lucky was a gem. A lot of people don't realise it was massive in America. Her first album went gold or platinum in America, but Stockacre and Waterman ran the show and were really uninterested in England and Europe. And they had major acts. They had Rick Astley, they had Bananarama. It was a production machine. And Kylie just exploded in England. But then was Kylie phase 2. She didn't tour a lot. And this is where I realised how special this girl was. She then started touring 5, 6, 7 years in. And before you know it, she's taking theatre shows on the road. The vision, her management, her creative people around her, it was absolutely phenomenal. She was bigger than Madonna at the time. In Europe, she was just became the Q live touring act of the year. Now, who would have expected this from the Kylie Minogue, the people rudely called the singing budgie? I think her relationship with Michael Hutchence, I've never heard her say a bad word to this day. They were so happy. She really learnt edge. She wanted to move on from Stockacre and Waterman, and I got her out of that contract. It cost me a few rights. She's actually back with the label for Australia and New Zealand, and I could talk about Kylie Minogue for hours and hours. And let me tell you, she can sing, and she has created something that is going to go on and on and on. And from that came Jason, and from that came Danny, and from that came Carol Hitchcock, who was a one-hit wonder, who hated Stockacre and Waterman, who could have been gigantic. She has a top 15 single in England and basically retires. But look, not everyone's after number ones. Some of the greatest musicians I've worked with want to play, be creative. And what's not commercial today, over the years I've seen become commercial and very successful later down the line. So many artists have success too quick, and it can work against them. And at the moment, you've got a situation where there's a lot of artists where they might have a top 10 song, they couldn't fill the corner hotel, and you'll never hear from them again. And the world's become much more song orientated, but let me tell you, there's still some big careers out there, and that's what I've hoped that I've instilled into my son. The reason I've kept working harder than ever is you can't force your kids into it. He's going to keep that Mushroom name, which is an iconic Australian name, going. He went out on his own for a while, but to have him in there, and something that's quite a little unknown fact is my daughter actually had a couple of hit singles. I couldn't sing a note. I didn't realise how good a singer she was. More importantly, how good a poet and writer she was. She did all the music for H2O, which was a worldwide success. Another TV show. She obviously didn't use the Gudinski name, wouldn't sound good on the charts. She used a shortened version of a middle name, Kate Alexa. She's doing a bit in movies and docos. There was a lot of guys that played pivotal roles at different times. Some we've talked about. There was a guy called Barry Earl who's passed away now, and Barry was very onto the whole English thing. And a lot of people don't realise when the Sex Pistols changed the face of music in England, in Brisbane, of all places, a police-run state at the time, which if you look at the history of music, when there's angst and there's rebellion, good music comes. Well, at the same time as the Sex Pistols were happening, the Saints recorded I'm Stranded. Chris Bailey was so far ahead of his time. It's a band that we end up working with later on down the line, and a band that went to England but never got to the heights, say, of the Sex Pistols. But people forget the Sex Pistols really weren't around for a long time, but they changed the face of music. And I'd never seen anything like it when I went to some of those small clubs in England, people spitting on each other for fun, believe it or not. But the intensity of the music. And Barry came back from England and was all hyped up about punk music. And Melbourne did have a thriving punk scene. And out of that Suicide label, we had this promotion. I'll never forget it. I have trouble looking at a chocolate bullet since. So we had boxes and boxes. In those days, all the staff chipped in and packed everything. And as a marketing tool, we had bullets, but chocolate bullets. But in that initial lot of acts that were signed came the Boys Next Door, the Teenage Radio Stars, Bo Dan, a couple of other acts I'm not thinking about at the minute, but to equate it to the modern age came Nick Cave, who we signed when he was 16. His first song was a cover. He never forgave me for it. I didn't know that he was so angry about it. But Greg McCage from the Skyhawks produced it. It was These Boots Are Made for Walking. Sean Kelly, who became the star of the Models, was in the Teenage Radio Stars. The late and great James Freud had a big solo success and then also joined the Models. So Suicide Records was a breakaway label that I made the decision that we'd do it through BMG, which was RCA at the time, because I didn't want it to interfere with what Mushroom had going at Festival, and I really didn't want to put the people at Festival through it, to be honest with you. And I thought it was the right thing to do, and in hindsight it was. We made an incredible compilation album that's worth a lot of money today because I think it was on white vinyl. The one thing that embarrasses me to this day is because it was white vinyl and perhaps we didn't go to the right manufacturer, the sound was crap. And we were always fastidious about sound. But I guess to a lot of people, the sound of that music was crap anyway. But that album became an iconic album. We all know the Boys Next Door went on to becoming the Bad Seeds. We've seen the incredible career that Nick Cave has had and how eloquent he is. But in fairness to Barry, he found these people at such a young age and gave this music an opportunity to get heard. And like a lot of good acts that are changing the face of music, it took some of them quite a while to even perfect their instruments. But it was an amazing period. The label was never really successful, but certainly some of the artists and people that came out of it are just amazing. And one of the things that has meant a lot to me is preserving history and not forgetting artists that have been part of your history and just move on to the next thing. And one of the great things, a guy that's worked for me for over 30 years, started as an agent, as a frontier, Gerard Chalecki, a true Victorian Melbourne boy. He put together the most incredible repackaging of Roland Howard's music. Now, Roland Howard was the guitar player back then. So when at the time you looked at the Suicide label, it was a disaster. But the musicians and the people and the talent that came out of it made me now look back in time and go, Jesus, that was just great shit. There was a saying that we really instilled, and I tried to instill, our artists are our strength. And some of the greatest artists take time. Australia was very fortunate that we had such a buoyant live scene, and I think it took a lot of people by surprise when they came here. A good example of that was when In Excess went, and unfortunately they weren't with us, but they were just, I was a fan of Australian music still, not just a business. They were just, you could see it the first time I saw Michael Hutchins at the Martini's pub in Carlton. He was a superstar. He had something special. And they worked hard and hard. So when they went and toured overseas, these acts that have been through the pub scene, which was such an important thing because bands played regularly and really, refined their art, they'd go overseas and people would be blown out. How the Angels weren't AC/DC. You talk about good luck and good timing. I mean, that band were just incredible. And you hear the two brothers playing the guitars now. It's about having some sort of uniqueness and having your own sound. So I think with Kylie, Christy Allen, Mushroom becoming a bigger independent label, I thought really it was time to have another breakaway label. And the reason that label started was because I was obsessed about signing the Hunters and Collectors. Obsessed. And when I get obsessed, I don't like losing. And there was queues down the road for all their gigs. You could feel the floor pumping at the Seaview Ballroom. But they were very intelligent guys. Well, they were part-time jobs. The band was a fun thing, but the singer had such a strength and they wrote some incredible songs. And the only way I could get that band to sign was to make them feel that we were setting up their own label. I'd seen it before internationally where acts had gone on, and in fact, the white label came because that was the final thing to really seal the Hunters deal. I'll never forget it. This was when I was in full motion, standing on my desk in the office going, if you guys don't sign, Mark Seymour will recall this story very well. And the Hunters and Collectors' first song, Talking to a Stranger, was like 8 or 10 minutes long. And we put it out on a white label, and why it was called white label was because in the days, and it's great that vinyl's back in action, as long as it's good quality, when you got an acetate, which was a technical term, it came on a white label. When I got a bit of flack in America because it seemed racist, it had nothing to do with it. So the white label began. And the Hunters Collectors' first song, Talking to a Stranger, had the most incredible video. And it was done by a guy that became a very, very successful filmmaker and is well known today, Richard Lowenstein. And it was people that were doing stuff like that in their early career. That video, which if you look at it today, is still weird. It mostly cost $4 or $5,000. But it was the start of not only that band's career, Lowenstein's career, etc., but really, when you think it, I'll never forget it. I was living in my first house in South Yarra, and I had no kids, Sue and I were there, and 4 o'clock in the morning, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. Now, you know when that happens, it's got to be Molly Meldrum. There's been a number of well-publicised instances later in life with him. So we actually took it out and put it on a white label without even saying anything on the white label. So he's so excited. He's got 3 of his mates in tow, come in the house. He plays the song so loud, and it was a small house, I've got neighbours everywhere, who cares? It took me to stop the music the third time he played the song to say, Molly, it's on my label. Can you get it, please? I'm glad you love it. And that was just typical of Molly's passion to music of all kinds. But the Hunters and Collectors took a lot longer. They did very well live, extremely well live. But it took a lot longer for them to get big crossover success. In fact, they were real stubborn. You could never push them around. But I'm telling you, to this day, guys, if you see this, I was right. We never recorded. We never got it right. You refused to budge. We did a couple of other versions, but Throw Your Arms Around Me has got to be one of the greatest Australian songs. Then they moved on, and much to the grumble of a few of them, we had some great international producers work with them, and they made a lot of albums. They were so far ahead of their time, they couldn't. I remember going to a gig to see them in Germany. There was 108 people there. Canada was a bit of a buzz, but they were too far ahead of their time. But I'll never forget when I toured Pearl Jam, the first time they came to Australia, Eddie Vedder came up to me and he said, man, I can't believe that I'm working for the promoter that signed Hunters and Collectors and Split Ends. He was such a fan of both those acts. And like I said, true artists are fans. Eddie Vedder to this day could not believe that the Hunters and Collectors never took off. And it was a frustration to them. It was a frustration to me. But then they became really big in this country and they had their own sound. Some of it was very, very original, but they also wrote some amazing songs. Do You See What I See? You could go through a list of them. So the White Label formed. And to clarify things, Paul Kelly was signed to Mushroom for a long time. I loved his songs. People in my office loved him. But similar to when I first heard Bob Dylan, I never thought the guy could sing. I'll certainly take that back now. But we moved him to the White Label because he felt good about it. I nearly dropped the guy, to be honest with you. And one of my staff, it's a famous story, holed up at the Seymour Townhouse in Sydney, ordering Veuve Clicquot, ringing me going, until you sort this out, we are not losing Paul Kelly. Now, there was a few versions of Paul Kelly. There was the Dots, there was the Messengers, and coming right around back to the White Label, there was the Coloured Girls. And Paul was desperate to be the special guest or support on Bob Dylan. We had to change the name Coloured Girls for that tour. No different than some people thought White Label was some racist jibe because of the Lou Reed song Coloured Girls, but Bob, I think, had whatever. And Paul happily changed the name of the band to do that tour. I mean, Paul just keeps on going without making the pun in leaps and bounds, and to see what he is doing today and the history that he's had, I'm so proud that I hung in with him at the time. And it's those critical albums, like who would have let Paul Kelly at a big label do a double album called Gossip? And it's those things that, make the differences. I think have made us very, very unique as far as, labels in history goes. We also got involved with a couple of other smaller independent labels that were struggling that I thought I could help. One of them was Hot Records that ended up with us having the Go-Betweens, who were so significant, but more significant now than they mostly were at the time. There was the Triffids, the late Dave McComb, who died too young. I remember working that song, Wide Open Road to Radio, and being so frustrated that it was not a hit. But some of the great songs fall under the carpets. In true fashion, the other act that was on the White Label that I can listen to today that were just so far ahead of their time was Big Pig. They brought percussion They brought sound, and that was the sort of acts that really, really inspired me. And, you know, some of the greatest music doesn't have to be number one. I wish Big Pig would have continued on, because really that sound should have become, if they'd hung in, if you listen to them now, you can see where Adam Ant came from, you can see where LCD sound system, where so much music, you know, has come, is from acts that when you first see them, you go, they're strange, but it's not strange. It's unique, and it's learning to create something that just isn't another rehash of something else. Indigenous music was very important to me at an early stage. I was a proud Australian, happy to be born here, unhappy to see what was going on. And because I worked with a lot of musicians that were way more intelligent than me, I really got the feel that it's not right. And I was so determined not to do Indigenous music for the sake of it. I was very close. In fact, we had the publishing well early on before Yothu Indy to No Fixed Address. I didn't manage them, and they weren't on our label. And it was frustrating for me to see them fall apart, because that was a very, very significant act. And he was a great songwriter. So a girl in my office, Jenny Hunter Brown, who could pick a song and could pick a songwriter, played me Yothu Indy. And what really got me was, it was the first album did nothing, but in true Mushroom tradition, we kept going. What I liked about it was the colour, the fact that they put effort into the show. This was a long time after Skolks and Split Ends. And the late and great Mundawa Yunupingu was very intelligent. He got it, and he wanted it. I'll never forget the head of Disney in America, Michael Eisner. Now, this is big Disney, and you've got me driving around in my hired Mustang in LA. I get a phone call, Michael Eisner wants to speak to you. And they drive off the road. So he goes, listen, there's a few people, they'd started a label called Hollywood Records at Disney. There's a few people in our label that are very keen, and I thought, if I rang you myself, it might make a difference. Do you want to come and see me? Okay. I ring the manager of Yothu Indy in Australia, Alan James, is a great bloke who did so much and still does for that catalogue and that band. I go and see this guy. He has no idea. Obviously he's got an idea, but he had no idea. He goes, do they have television in the Outback? And if I would have told the band some of the things he was asking. So they got a deal, and before that, in fairness, Midnight Oil took them on the road in America. One of them went walkabout, one of them came home, but it was such an eye-opener for that band, and was such a great thing that Midnight Oil did. They get a record deal. The second album comes and we hear Treaty. Now, the key to Treaty was, if you listen to the original version, it would have just been another great song with an incredibly strong lyric. But we got Peter Garrett involved, and we got Paul Kelly involved, and they co-wrote that song. But the key to that song was, there was a club that had opened in Melbourne when mixing and remixing and all this stuff was really just starting. The Razor Club was an amazing club because it was on the cutting edge of the start of dance music. It used to be only on Friday nights, thank God, and I must admit I got home at 6 or 7 a.m. some mornings. It really didn't start till midnight, but there was a feel. There was unisex toilets. And the guys that were spinning the discs were passionate, and I love passion. So they said to me, can we have a crack at Treaty? They took the original Treaty and turned it into an absolute anthem. The first number one, I get goosebumps talking about this, the first number one song that an Indigenous group has ever had. I've been waiting years for it. When that club shut down, I've got to say, my wife did break out the champagne. But again, it goes back to my central theme, leaders, not followers. That mix of Treaty, and then I ring up Alan James, who's living in Darwin or Gove, and there was a couple of, they say, white fellas in that band as well. I go, we've remixed the song. He goes, what are you doing? The elders, you can't change, What I said, well, hang on a minute. You didn't tell me this. Can I send it to you and you listen to it? So there was quite a process to actually go through, but everyone was happy. But I'll never forget the first reaction of that mix to this day. It was a huge hit in Germany. As for Michael Eisner at Hollywood, they didn't deliver America. It never really worked in England, but the song to this day, and I'm so proud to say that on their tour currently to see Midnight All Back Together, they're performing that song some nights, and they're sticking to the remix type version, and they play it so well. And Yothu Yindi really paved the way, and from that came Christina Nu, but most probably the greatest long-term artist, and it's never bothered me, and I've never looked at it as a money-making thing. We all like to sleep well at night, and to see the acclaim that Archie Roach is now getting after all these years and everything that he's been through, and that song, They Took the Children Away, there's songs of my life that were just songs that meant so much. That would have to be one of them. And when Mushroom was sold, and I mostly restarted a couple of years too quick on the rebound, the first act that came back was Archie. And we did an album with his late wife, Ruby, but it makes me feel that it's opened up so much for young Indigenous talent, and there's so much of it in so many different areas. So I guess that made up for anyone that thought the white label had the wrong connotation. But it was very important to me to do it properly. And, now we're working with Dan Sultan, who's just another incredible singer and artist. But that stuff meant a lot to me. And people should understand so much of the music that we were involved with, I never thought would make money. It wasn't about it making money. And if when the song went to number one, it just blew everyone's mind. And I think they're the special moments of an incredible history of Mushroom that are just outstanding. And I get quite emotional talking about Archie Roach. He's one of the foundation members of the Music Vault, and to see him find happiness again after the death of his close partner means more to me than a number one song with Archie Roach, and I think it means more to him. Look, the sale of Mushrooms is a touchy subject. I sold the first 49% to Rupert. He came to me many years before. Whatever people want to think about that guy, we've all read and heard, the guy was a man of his word and he lived up to it. And, I had other businesses to go and concentrate on. I mean, I love the touring. I'm not that involved with the label these days. There's 3 or 4 acts that I might be involved in. The one thing about touring big internationals or big locals, it's hello at the airport and it's goodbye when they leave. It's a defined time. But it was very sad for me and I was frustrated. But I did make sure that Jimmy Barnes and the Hunters and Collectors catalogues would become back to them. Knowing that full well and the relationship I had with Jimmy, who was pretty shocked when I sold the label, I had a non-compete for another 18 months or something else. And when I say, and I'm being a bit serious here, but it's true, I was busting to start a label again. And because of legal reasons, they went through all the myriad of companies. It was too difficult for them to take over the name Liberation. So that was something that was left for me. Not that they left it for me. So that's how Liberation went from being an international label to being the new label. And when I say maybe I came back too quick on the rebound, I came back for the wrong reasons. Yes, we had Jimmy, we had the Hunters catalogue, but we signed 6 acts and the label really didn't have much success for a period of time, and it was quite humbling. But it didn't deter me because I was still such a believer in Australian music. And I set up a new label with Corder Marshall, one of the greatest A&R people I've ever known, who took over running Mushroom in England and became the head of Warner's, called Infectious. And it started to come good. Another band that was so different to anything else, Alt J. When that happened, Damien Slevinson, one of the original MDS staff, came back and he found a band called the Temper Trap. I went and saw them. There would have been 30 people there. And they had the song Sweet Disposition. It was such a song, one of the greatest Australian songs of all time. Now, this tells you the state, and it's still a problem to this day, about Australian radio and media supporting their own. We released that song 2 or 3 times in Australia. Had it not been top 5 in England, that song could have been gone. It was the song of the year. It was the album of the year. It was written at a place that's very close to me, Mount Macedon near Hanging Rock. And all of a sudden, after very little success, my son was getting involved by the stage, going, look at this crap that you've signed. But Temper Trap, in the nick of time, a hero arises, and it's a massive worldwide song. But really, it's shocking to think if that had not been a hit in England, that it may never have been the song of the year, number 1 in Australia. So look, slowly but surely, Liberation's getting back on its feet. My son's got a label called Elusive, and hip-hop is another style of music that people perhaps didn't think was going to last. Let me tell you, it ain't going nowhere. There's, like any type of music, there's junk hip-hop, there's gangster hip-hop, and there's real music in hip-hop. And you'll see more and more white hip-hop artists. You'll see more and more hip-hop producers working with wide acts. No difference to the days of Muddy Waters and the Stones taking it over. No one wants to take it over. But there are so many music styles that you've got to have the people that understand it. But I must admit, I was very worried that I'd started Liberation too fast for the wrong reasons, and it's something that disappointed me greatly, that I couldn't really help James and Lachlan see the dream of Mushroom Records taking over worldwide. But the beat goes on, I got paid a few bob, and I'm not complaining. This is quite a well-discussed fact. I heard the Cold Chisel demos, and I don't care what anyone tells me, Jimmy Barnes wasn't singing on them. They had the same manager as a great band from Adelaide called Stars. So as the stories become legendary, I signed Stars and knocked back Cold Chisel. History will be what it is, but Chisel launched their album. They were a great rock band at the Bombay Rock, which is a club that I used to have up in Sydney Road in Brunswick. And Jimmy was just, you could tell he had the fire in his eyes. And we were the agents for Chisel, Frank Stavala was, and him and I became very friendly with Jimmy. And quite friendly with the band, but much more Jimmy. And as the band got bigger and bigger, I don't think they really liked the fact that we were just friends and we'd be hanging out all the time, etc. And there was nothing more to it than we got on well. He's most probably one of the greatest singers of our generation. Him and I have had a number of arguments about him screaming versus how great a singer he is. But he's really stood the test of time. He's mostly had 4 careers. A lot of people don't understand that Jimmy Barnes solo has mostly sold 2 or 3 times the amount of albums that Cold Chisel did. Chisel were very frustrated. They toured in America. He wrote that famous song, You've Got Nothing I Want, about an American record company executive. And as with a lot of bands in that era, it came a time, and because my wife and I were so friendly with Jane and Jimmy, out of the blue I get a phone call. Michael, it's Jimmy. Can you come up to Barrel, where he had a small place at the time? I says, my birthday goes even better. Come up. The band's breaking up. I've left. I just went quiet. I couldn't believe it. Now, some people would say I broke up like Cold Chisel. I wish I had the power. I would have done it years before. I'm saying that lightheartedly. But the minute that phone call happened, I was determined to make sure that we signed Jimmy Barnes solo. And what impressed me about Jimmy was everything I knew about it, but he wanted to not muck around. Jimmy always wanted things. I want it now. Let's keep moving. Let's keep going. Let's keep doing. So instead of there being some huge gap, he was determined. Until we got up there and spent a couple of days, I didn't think he was actually serious and they'd all work it out, etc. And look, they've reformed a couple of times. They're still a great band. But Jimmy solo was something very, very important and special to Mushroom. We signed him. The song that I still think is one of the greatest songs he's written is an absolute anthem, and it's one of those songs that we've recorded a few times. It was a big hit, but there's sometimes songs that you just don't get it exactly right. No Second Prize, the first single from Body Swerve, his first album, to me is an absolute sports anthem. So he toured, which I like artists doing. He toured with the new songs. He went out on the road pretty quick. And we went into the studio and he'd been recording for a while. And at this stage, I didn't want to put pressure, and I wasn't spending as much time in the studio as I used to because there was actually so much going on, and I mostly didn't really have the patience as well. So he rings me up, he goes, listen, I think it's time you've come up and have a listen to some of the songs, how they're going. So I get there and they're all looking at me, and I hate that when you're in the studio and everyone's looking at you and you're going, here we go. So he puts on this thing that is absolute country music. Now, he knows I'm not a big fan of old-fashioned hip, hick country. I'm listening to these 3 songs and I look at the cassette. It's got Jim Barnes Band, Barn Band. But I didn't say anything, but you could tell I was freaked out. So the whole studio breaks into raptures. Yes, they conned me. Yes, they got me. At least I didn't go, it was bloody shit hot. You've done it, mate. This is a smash. I was like in shock. And then bang, he put on 3 tracks. And No Second Prize was the first track I heard. And I was like in heaven. And henceforth started a massive, massive run. 2 families that grew together and continued. We travelled the world together. The kids grew up together. Somehow we put the Tin Lids, all our kids, as the #1 album. But eventually I became Jimmy's manager as well. And the biggest frustration was we were so close in America. And he was touring with ZZ Top. He had big-time American management. I really was still desperate. I'm still chasing that big #1 album single. I've had a couple of #2s, and we were so close, but yet so far. But the road with Jimmy has been a long and winding road. To see him in the form that he is at the moment, to read his first book, which his family and I knew very little about any of it, was quite astonishing. His lifestyle, when you're young, and the famous vodka bottle, if I had my time again, we would have set up our own vodka and it would have been a marketing genius. But he's such a fan of music. He's gone through, we've all read about it, the ups and downs, the financial woes, drug woes, whatever. The guy's got a heart of gold. I've managed him for quite a while. He's still with the label and he's got the most amazing catalogue. But a lot of people don't know how close he was to succeeding in America. And a lot of people don't know that he didn't write Working Class Man, and it was actually a country song, funnily enough, after the whole story of the Jim Barnes Band. And his version of Working Class Man became an iconic Australian, without a doubt, anthem. And to see him still continuing to be so prolific, the fact that we're both alive. Of course, I was in the next room, answering telexes and on the phone, working. But it was the days of wildness and a lot of different phases. But he kept making music, and he's kept making music. When he came to me about Soul Deep, this was all him. He's always loved great music of all types. I said to him once, mate, if you didn't have a career as a singer, you'd be my head of A&R, signing acts. I remember playing to Jimmy Barnes the garbage demos. He rings me up, he goes, I bet you haven't even listened to this, have you? I said, I had a quick listen. He goes, you have got something here. Understand it. This is special. And Garbage was the band that Butch Vig, who produced Nirvana, became the whole thing that put Mushroom in England into a label that Radiohead had their first independent single through, Muse were on, etc. But he is resilient, and to see him singing better than ever is inspiring. And I said to him once, we were on a show, I said, so when we're old, and this is when we were now most probably late 30s or something, I said to him, how's your voice going to be? What's going to happen? He goes, I'm telling you now, I'll be singing till the day I die and my voice will get better and better. Look at James Brown. And it's so true. I'll never forget it. And to see him in such good form, to see him reveal a lot of his demons, etc. I think it's a first book is he's an incredible writer as such, has won prizes and prizes. The next book that's just come out, which will be phenomenal, but he's an example of someone that when he wants to do something, he wants to do it right. And to see him performing the way he's performing and going to a next level is fantastic, because it's well documented, some of the troubles, etc. But he'll sing till the day he drops, and he is part of the Australian fabric. And I think that the fact that he's involved his audience that's grown up with him even more, because look, a lot of people have been through that stuff. But for someone as high profile as him to come out and be honest enough to say it, I think has been not only so great for himself, but has been so great for so many people. So not only did we have an incredible run of successes, did we do barnstorming, double happiness. When Jimmy sets his mind on something and he's focused, there's no one better. I'd most really think he's the biggest male artist in this country. And if he's not, his mate John Farnham, which day of the week. They're both incredible singers that get on well. We had a huge number one hit together, Something's Wrong with My Baby. But he never, ever write Jimmy Barnes off, and I will never not be there for him. It's quite emotional and it's quite special, because particularly in a cutthroat business like we're in, when you find loyalty, you've got to treasure it. And he'd be someone I'd want in the trenches behind me. It's a very different industry today. If you'd asked me the same question 10 years ago, is there the same loyalty? No. As the dice swapped from the record company more to the live touring end, has it become fairer for artists? Yes, which is a good thing. People were saying to me 10, 15 years ago, there's no careers. Who's going to be the next Eagles, Stones, Springsteen, Fleetwood Mac? They'll never happen again. Well, let me tell you, Adele has certainly shown that she's no one-hit wonder and has just got fans that relate to her and most probably play her music every day of their lives. The little red-headed fella who's like my stepson, Ed Sheeran, I underestimated myself. His manager worked at Mushroom Records in the UK for 10 years. Thank God I was a brilliant boss. He was a shy guy. He learned so much from the senior people at Mushroom in England. But I never realised this kid's not talented. He's gifted. Now, this is a busker. This is a guy that got dropped by his label of management before his first album came out. He already had 8 tracks done. I've heard him sit there in front of my wife and his parents and just strum the songs. I haven't seen many acts that can go from being very young female appeal. He's now crossed all the way over. Now, he's had 3 huge albums in a row. Let's see what happens with Taylor's next album. But biggest show of the world tour was in Sydney. So we still are striving to think that there are more and more careers, and I've left a few acts out. I mean, the Foo Fighters have obviously been around a long time. And if one more person asks me if Dave Grohl is real and he's like he comes across, let me tell you, he's the real deal. And I think that there's a number of artists that are now thinking much more, have got much more control of their careers. And I think that if you do the right thing by them, there is a bit more loyalty coming back in the business. Artists have got much more control of their careers, which I've always thought was a good thing. It was the basis of Mushroom Records in the first place. And, I'm quite excited about the future. Am I concerned about Australian artists, no different to film directors, to painters, to so many things, having to go overseas? Yes, I am. I think if Paul Keating's era hadn't happened, the creative arts of Australia wouldn't be what it became. And I think it's time for people to really, solid up like that. But careers are hard, to the point where I've been talking to my son a lot, who's really responsible for so much of the label stuff now, is we've mostly got too many acts that we're believing are going to be career acts, and we mostly haven't got enough planned number ones, hit singles, because I've always believed in the long term. It's amazing that some of the songs from the past, from acts that mightn't have lasted that long, have been such influences. And that's why I think there's been court cases about songs and court cases now. You got to remember, music didn't enter people's lives that much. Yes, I heard a bit of jazz because my sister liked jazz when I was young, but it's different now. Music's part of every curriculum, and it's natural that when you're young and you hear the chords or something of a song, and some of these cases I don't think are intentional. They're not malicious. It just, kids are getting into music, which is such a great thing. And what a lot of people don't realise is there are so many parts to it around. It's not like, there's so many jobs and so much employment, and I'm hoping that, like the Victorian government have taken the music vault seriously, I'm hoping to think that arts and creative policies are going to become more important. In the big picture of a messed up world that we've got, it mightn't be important to a lot of people, but it's the fabric that makes our lives, I believe. And I think that's why people are really thriving on the history of Australian music. I think people are realising that we're not all here forever, that the tragedies around George Young, Tom Petty, the list goes on. I think, the Travelling Wilburys were an example. I bought my first song when I was 12. I had the Travelling Wilburys confirmed to tour Australia, and Roy tragically passed away. And I think that our heroes and the people that have been around a long time, it's so good to see really young people listening to the relevant music that stands up. And I guess it's no different in 2 generations' time for some of these great artists that I've been involved with to be looked at like Tchaikovsky or Beethoven. That's what I'd like to think.